So today our reflection is shared jointly by three of our congregants. Personal reflections on Memorial Day. Speaking will be Robert Burchess, Gayle Smith, and Neil Marinello sharing.
Can you hear me? Anne, can you hear me in the back? Okay then, so way back in the 60s, when the never-ending Vietnam War infiltrated so many of our lives, I wrote down these words and called it collateral damage. Dead man walking. Went something like this. Tight ropes of memory split under the heavy step of some orphan who knows how old kid I saw. Falling, shivering, shaking among those brutal burial grounds. The kid, already with that 1,000-yard stare, shell-shocked, numb, bombed-out hair, long-torn dreams pulled from their socket, windows sealed tight, stark new nursery, no children allowed. The sound of sorrow is a dead wind, knowing the secrets of old homesteads, chimneys of a life's passage, dying feet of a war-torn age, stumbling their mournful way through bloody theaters of the absurd. Incinerated morning dawns and dreams, forever frozen in time, splattered across the killing fields of human invention, stillborn, in purgatory, cocooned in solitary confinement, between being and nothingness. All that was ever life, choked in chains, mangled on the crimson plains, lost among the twisted leaves, dead among the gasping birds. So back then in the late 60s and 70s, during that seemingly endless ongoing Vietnam conflict, way back, before many of you young'uns were even born, there was then a tremendously popular TV show that all of America watched every week. It was called MASH. It was a poignant mixture of wartime hospital drama full of action and emotion and dark gallows humor. But unlike so many of us who watched all this from the comfort and safety of our homes here in the U.S., Gayle Smith lived it 24/7 in Vietnam, where back in 1970 she enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps serving in a MASH unit. But she was only a 20-plus-year-old new young nurse. Even though she was opposed to the war, even though she felt it was wrong, but instead of safely choosing not to serve, she wanted to bring back all our boys who didn't belong there in the first place, and was willing to sacrifice her life to do just that. So, it is an honor and privilege to introduce to you Gayle Smith and Dr. Neil Marinello, who will share some of their stories and reflections.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for being here. If you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try and do something to make it better. The person speaking here has hearing aids in both ears, so I understand not being able to hear. Bob, thank you for that introduction. I want to tell my story around 3 events, basically. The first event is around my mother. She told me that when she was a little girl, excuse me, they would go to the cemetery on Memorial Day and picnic. And they would celebrate, you know, lives going on, their parents and so on. To be honest, I can't even imagine having a picnic in the cemetery, but that's what they did. When I go, I celebrate my mom and dad's lives. They were wonderful parents to both of us. Excuse me. My mom's last words, she was 97 when she passed away. She was actually walking until 2 weeks before she died. But she leaned up on one arm and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, I'm not dead yet, darn it all." She's an awesome lady. And the second part is about my experiences in Vietnam. I was 23 years old when I went, and for many years, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you even being here, being willing to hear about this, because I hid my experience for many years. People didn't want to know what I experienced and what it was like. One person asked me one time about, even the first year after I got back, what it was like, and I began to say something, and I could tell right away, you don't say anything about it anymore. Don't tell anyone what you did or what you saw. So I kept my mouth shut for a long time. People didn't want to know what we endured. And as Bob said, I was opposed to the war. And Matt and I go to the wall. Do you know what the wall is? It's a long, black granite memorial on Washington, and on which there are 58,000 men and 8 nurses. And when I was in basic training, I learned how those nurses died. Some of those nurses died. The first 2 were on a mission to pick up the wounded, and they died in helicopter crashes. The last 2 was an Air Force nurse and an Army nurse on an aircraft, and they had a plane load of orphans, and the plane crashed on takeoff, and they all perished. Sharon Lane was killed. She was on duty, and her hospital had a murder rocket attack come in, and she was killed. And this I learned from some CIA dudes that I knew in basic training. They said, they knew I was going to Vietnam, and they said, you know, we know that there was a hospital up north that was overrun, and patients were shot, and the term used was 3 of those nurses were massacred. And they said, you sure you want to do this? And I said, yeah, I've made a commitment. And then it kind of came, I said, you know, I might not make it back. So, and I might not come back. So, just before I left, I called my sisters together and I gave away my things. And I said, if I come back, I want my shit back. And I said, if you come back, okay. So I also saw where I was going to be buried. Mom and Dad had a plot next to theirs. My mother always said she was glad she had girls because she didn't have to worry about them going to war like Daddy did. Daddy was a World War II vet. He was an anti-aircraft gunner. And he was in Europe. And I will remember this scene like it was yesterday. When I was at the airport and Mom and Dad were saying goodbye to me. And I turned to get on the plane. And I looked back and Mom and Dad had his arm around Mom, and I knew she was crying. And I looked at them and I thought, I wonder if I'll ever see him again. And it's like that for everybody. You wonder, am I ever going to see him again? So when I stand and look at the wall in Washington, I touch the names of those that I knew that were on the post with me. They died in helicopter crashes. Some trying to rescue people, and others that you just couldn't save. They're just too far gone, just couldn't save them. So when I look at that, I thought, you know, I'm 76, and the average age of my patients was 19. They were draftees, most of them. And I thought, they missed the whole thing. They missed all of this. The journey to the wall is very, very tough. When I was down there one of the last times, you know, I usually go on Veterans Day, and there are servicemen there to try and help you find the names on the wall. And he said, you know, there was a fella here with a service dog. You'll often see service dogs there. And you know, service dogs are like totally focused on their handler. They don't, you know, stray from that at all. And he said, this one fellow was there with a service dog. And there was a group of men over here farther. And the service dog broke away from him and went up to this group of men. And the handler went up to the group and he says, I'm really sorry, you know, my dog has never done this. And I didn't know that when servicemen are given service dogs, they're often given the name of a fallen soldier. So the dog was focused on this one man. And so this man and the handler began to talk, and he said, well, what's the name of your dog? And it was the same name as the man's brother that was on the wall. Now, I don't know how this works. Someday we'll figure that out. It was like the story keeps unfolding. 2 weeks ago, a film company from London called me, and they're doing a documentary on the Vietnam War. And so they had my stories in a book that Sherry's read. And so they read that, so they wanted to interview me, so they did, you know, over the phone. And I thought, you know, I don't really care to be in a part of a film, as long as some good comes from it. So she said to me, do you remember the names of anybody, you know, that you took care of? I said, yeah. I took care of one fellow. You know, when I first came on duty, I had 22 beds right straight in front of me. And so I would look at them, you know, and they would usually be sitting up or talking to each other in the beds or something like that. And I'd also see how much fluid was left in their IV bottles as I went along. And then this fellow over here was quiet, and he was still. So I said, that's not right. So I went down, and he was cold, clammy, diaphoretic. I threw the covers back, and he was sitting in a pool of blood. And he was a Navy SEAL. Now, I don't know if you know what Navy SEALs do. They are basically assassins. And he had multiple gunshot wounds, and he had his leg amputated, and he was bleeding out from his stump. So, you know, I did what I needed to do to save his life, and, you know, tourniquet and blood and all that stuff. And so this film person got a hold of him. And last week, he called me. And he said, thank you for saving my life. He said, I must have been sleeping. I said, you were sleeping all right. But, you know, and so he told me about the fellas he was with, some of whom had been killed in action. And I said to him, have you ever been down to the wall? And he said, no, but I know I need to go. And I said, I go on November 11th, and I will be there. If you go, I will be there for you. And he said, I will be there. So, I mean, I'll tell you, going to the wall is really hard. The third part of my journey is about when I went to Normandy. It was cold and rainy, just like it was probably on the landing on June 6th of 1944. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, that the first 20 minutes is hardcore. I mean, apparently it is really what it was like. Well, that battle, it was very intense. That battle lasted 12 hours. So we saw 20 minutes of it. The battle was, I can't even imagine being in that kind of intensity for 12 hours. And on that day, just in 12 hours, 2,500 Americans, this is just the Americans, were killed. There were 106,000 wounded or missing. Now, you understand they're shot in the water, so, you know. And on it's actually it's a big, huge beach. There's a big embankment. And on the plateau is the cemetery. And that cemetery is row after row after row after row after row of crosses. And I think, what must be like going to battle? You know, when I got the leftovers from the battle. When I saw, you know, they were pretty relieved to see me because they knew that after they saw me, they were going to go home. But when I was going back to the wall for a minute, we were just leaving the wall, and there was a man coming on. I don't know if you know what a Purple Heart is. It's an award you get if you're wounded in action. There was a man, and it was clear to me, this is his first visit, and he was walking forward, and he was determined, and he was focused, and he was courageous, and there was all at the same time abject fear in his face. I thought, that's what must be like going into battle. I mean, I've never seen a face like that. I mourn the losses, and I celebrate their lives, and profound bravery going into World War II, in part because they're going to demolish the concentration camp and free the survivors. And my wonderful husband, who is sitting there, lost 12 of his relatives in the death camps. So sometimes we celebrate, sometimes we mourn, and sometimes we don't, both. But I want to thank you all for even being willing to listen when so many others didn't even want to hear.
I've never been to war, but my entire life was controlled by the Vietnam War from 1960 to 1975. Most people here probably, well, some of you look like you may remember some of those times. I'll tell you what it was like for me. My father died in 1960 suddenly, and that probably is the major thing that had an effect on my life. What they say is that you really only experience death once, even though you see a lot of people die. But the first time when you realize what it means, that the person is not going to be there anymore. I mean, I had stepped on ants before, but it didn't have the same effect as the death of my father. I had a couple of immediate reactions when he died, which it took me 10 years to remember, because they were not acceptable. First reaction was I was furious with him for dying on me. I was extremely inconsiderate of him. There was a 15-year-old boy who needed his father. The second reaction was even worse. If one of my parents had to die, I wish it had been my mother. 10 years later, I remembered it in therapy. It's just absurd to try and understand what death means and what Memorial Day means. But they're very closely tied together. Memorial Day originally started apparently as Decoration Day in 1865, and it was first observed as a result of the Civil War, and apparently there was quite a bit of black and white issues that took place, but Decoration Day was a way that the black people managed to worship and, in fact, decorate the graves of the people who had died in the Civil War. It later got co-opted, and the Southern and Northern issues became major, as did the black and white issues, and they still go on to this day. War, to me, is absurd, and yet the positions are extreme, and as someone who's studied how the mind works for his entire life, I realize it comes down to the fact that we're all animals. That animals basically have three reactions which go back millions of years, and those are fight, flight, freeze. And there's a part of our brain that reacts that way, fight, flight, freeze. So you've got lions, you've got rabbits, you've got possums. And all of us have a part of our brain which operates that way. The part of the brain that's been around for now 300,000 years, the frontal cortex, that part of the brain tends to be subjugated by the fight, flight, freeze reaction. And this good guy, bad guy, you know, it's been around for quite a while. but it's the reaction, the result of the fight, flight, freeze reaction. The truth is that everything winds up polarized in that part of the brain, and I've had to deal with it inside the minds of myself and the people I've been meeting with over the years. At any rate, my experience was 1961, I went to college, and that was a school which a lot of people revere. I'm not sure I do. It's Harvard. 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. He robbed Harvard of all of their major brains. And then in 1961 and 62, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were two psychology professors who were kicked out for passing out LSD to undergraduates. I was an undergraduate, and I'm not sure I got any from them, but I did do a bit of LSD. I understand we have an experiment that's going to be going on in this town fairly soon with that. At any rate, 1963, Kennedy got shot, and just before that, there had been this Bay of Pigs business, which was a total failure on his part, but those of us at Harvard were ready to take up arms and go to Cuba and fight bad Castro. After Kennedy was shot, a lot of the thoughts that he had and a lot of the things he wanted to do, which had been totally eliminated and denied in Congress, not too dissimilar to some things that are happening recently here. Fortunately, LBJ Johnson wound up taking up and passing nearly all of the programs that he had, which would have just died in the water otherwise. My issue was the draft. And everything, I wanted to quit school. I knew I could do school, I didn't know I could do life. So I had decided I was going to quit school. My mother decided that she didn't want me to quit school, and she was a lawyer. She did free legal work for the clerk of my draft board, and in return asked that I be told I'd be the first person drafted and sent to Vietnam if I quit school. I wound up walking into New York City with $2 in my pocket, relatives in Yonkers, and ready to die rather than contact them, see if I could do life. About 3 weeks later, I figured I could. But the best way to do it was to say that I was a high school dropout and not a Harvard sophomore. The reality, though, is that I stayed at college, and in 1965 I graduated and went into a program in clinical psychology, a doctoral program at Boston University. And in 1966, 1 year after I entered that program, it stopped being a way of getting out of the draft to be a graduate student. So I had to leave. At that point, the next best way to get a deferment was to be working at a place that would write you a letter that said you were necessary and essential to their functioning, and that had to be a nonprofit. So I worked for 3 years at a school for delinquents. And just as I was about to turn 26, this was before, by the way, the draft numbers came around. Just before I was about to turn 26, I was called for a physical. And I had to decide. I said, okay, am I going to go to Canada? Because that was the thing to do at that point. And I decided I couldn't live with myself if I did, but I thought I'd fight it every way I could. And about a week before my physical, I was at that time working at a school for emotionally disturbed boys, and went to an orthopedic surgeon who lived very near where the school was, and said, gee, I've had trouble with my back about, once or twice a year, and I wonder if you'd take a look at it. And she said, why are you really here? And I said, I don't want to go to Vietnam. And turned out that she was a graduate of McGill, which is a school in Canada, and she was sympathetic. Whether that had anything to do with the letter she wrote, which got me out of the physical, I don't know. But I have a feeling it did, since I've only had problems with my back about 4 times in the last 30 years. At any rate, everything about my life was controlled by that, by the draft. And I had decided I would actually go if I had to go. I had also decided that I would not fire my gun if I was given a gun. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but it basically came down to the fact that I could not take another life. At the same time, the literature shows that about 30 to 35% of the people who were in combat never fired their guns. And when you start talking about Memorial Day, the truth is you're talking about life and death, and an issue where people my age, or people even 40 or 50 years younger than I, there wouldn't be any wars if we had to go fight. 18-year-olds don't understand life and death. They really don't. They have no idea what it is. In fact, the studies of the brain show that the brain is not formulated really until about age 25. So what it comes down to is war, of course, is total baloney. It's this part of the brain that breaks everything down into good and bad, good guys, bad guys, black and white, whatever the heck it is. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that it changes our lives. So what's the bottom line? From my point of view, it's that nobody gets out of life alive. It's all about how you significate it. And that's a word that I made up. What meaning you give. What meaning you give to the experiences you have. The only real thing that we know is that after you die, the way in which you're remembered is in the minds and hearts of those who care about you. And that's what today is about. Thank you.
No words, no matter how precious or poetic, can ever suffice or do all this justice. Nevertheless, we try. And the larger the picture we look at, perhaps the sadder it gets. That's just stuff I wrote down as some attempt to give a little intro to a similar effort of another poet that seems to fittingly end this kind of a session. Back around 1919, in the wake of World War I, so many, Russian Revolution, Irish Rebellion, William Butler Yeats began writing a somewhat mysterious poem that even now no critic seems to fully understand. But it just has a certain sound that most living people can resonate to, unfortunately. It reflects the ravages of war, his total despair, haunted by the fact that human history seems to just keep repeating itself in the worst horrific ways. God, just listen to the news today. Going all the way back to the Crusades and other holy wars where mankind wonderfully, horrifically destroys itself in the name of God and religion. Guess this is why so many of us are kind of, halfway religion Unitarian. Anyway, we're going to end with this. He called it fittingly, as you can imagine, the second coming. So this is how it goes. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best, like all conviction, while the worst, are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the heart of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert bird. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Thank you all for listening, and special thanks again to Gayle and Neil. Thank you.
So today I'm using a benediction from the church I attended in Massachusetts, from the Reverend Claire Feingold Thorne. She did not write it. Her UU mentor, who was another female UU minister, passed it on to her, and she in turn got it from yet another UU female minister. So it's got a long history of being passed around, though I could not tell you originally where it came from. In our comings and in our goings, may the light of love shine upon us, out from within us, be gracious unto us, and bring us peace. For this is the day we are given. May we rejoice and be glad in it. Thank you all for being here today. Good Sunday.